Okay, so I'm going to try and mention as many colleagues as I can. Otherwise, if I mention them all, I'll be here all day. Some people won't get a mention, but their names will appear here. Some people will appear on a slide. I don't think poor Luke is going to appear anywhere, but anyway, we'll give him a nod now. So I'll do my best to kind of cover everyone. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take you through some of the experiments with open education that we've been conducting here at Coventry over the last few years. And they start in 2009 with the open media agenda of the media department, which is now the School of Media and Performing Arts. It gets complicated because the names change regularly. And that led to our open media classes, which you can see here on the left, and publications of books such as Open Education, A Study in Disruption, which you can see on the right. I'm going to come back to some of these as we kind of go through. That was then followed by the creation of our Centre for Disruptive Media. That was in 2011, where we've produced projects such as the Living Books About Life series, you can see here, and Photomediation's An Open Book, which is down there in the bottom right corner. Again, I'm going to come back to talk about those in a little bit more detail. And then out of that was what Marina was talking about, which is the Disruptive Media Learning Lab in 2004. And that's led not by me, but by Jonathan Shaw, who produced this kind of experimental project called New Photoscapes. And then finally, there's the new research that we're just about maybe to launch, which is itself a disruption of the Centre for Disruptive Media. There's lots of disruption in this. So I might talk about that in the end, depending on how brave I get and who I can see in the room and whether it's appropriate or not. So what I'm going to say is a kind of a gathering together of the arguments of all these projects, and it's kind of been articulated among other places across these three books. If you want to kind of go and look at them in more detail, these would be places to start, and you can find them all free online if you need them, or you can ask me and I can send you them. Okay, so how as researchers working, as Marina says, in media and cultural studies and critical theory and continental philosophy, how did we come to be so interested in online learning and open education and MOOCs and so on? And that was way back in 2009, 2010, so that's kind of long before the development of MOOCs, such as Udacity and Coursera in 2012. So to explain that, I need to place open education in a bit of a broader context for you. And I'm going to begin doing that with the protests that from 2010 onwards have taken place in the UK around the future of the university. And the reason I'm beginning with this year, you've got to remember this year and this date, it'll become clear, kind of through the talk and particularly by the end. So as you may remember in December 2010, many of those protesting outside Parliament in London against the introduction of university tuition fees found themselves being met with a forceful police response. This included being kettled, which is the top left, struck with batons and charged with horses. So subsequently, a number of protesters were given harsh prison sentences. Among them was Charlie Gilmore. He's a student at Cambridge and son of Pink Floyd's Nick, who was sentenced to 12 months for, among other things, as you can see there, swinging from a Union flag on the Cenotaph War Memorial in London. Meanwhile, Alfie Meadows, which you can see top right, a university student who was struck on the head with a police baton during the 2010 protests and left with bleeding on the brain, he had to face a long, drawn-out trial before finally being found not guilty of violent disorder in March 2013. And since then, there's been a number of student occupations designed to oppose privatisation, including the outsourcing of services and the selling off of the student debt that's been created by the introduction of tuition fees. So on December the 4th, 2013, police evicted students from an occupation at the University of London without permission from the courts to do so, and with many activists again alleging assault. On that occasion, 40 students were arrested. But these protests aren't a thing of the past, nor are they even restricted to students. So this year, outsourced cleaners at the LSE, all from minority or migrant backgrounds, they've been striking for the same terms and conditions of employment as the university's in-house staff. But this is a kind of a history of Recent protests could easily be widened to take in things like Occupy Wall Street and the London riots of 2011, the anti-austerity movement in Spain that began the same year and produced the Indignados and Podemos, as well as the horizontal groundswell against the old politics of the political and media establishment that was such a feature of the 2014 Scottish independent referendum. In fact, you could say it's the latter in particular has been behind a lot of what's happened since. The reaction to the Scottish referendum feeding into the 2015 general election, which in turn led to Brexit, the Jeremy Corbyn phenomena, the election result in June, which many people voted for the scrapping of tuition fees, and the shift in public mood against austerity, something that's intensified noticeably after the Grenfell Tower fire. So the reason I'm beginning with these protests is because for the last few years, myself and a number of colleagues have been exploring the extent to which they pose a challenge for those of us who work in the university. How can we act not so much for or with the anti-austerity protesters and the graduates without a future? There can be something kind of a bit patronising, a bit narcissistic about that. But in terms of them, as the philosopher Michel Foucault puts it, when he was asked whether he wrote his books, The Uses of Pleasure and Technologies of the Self, for the liberation movement of the 1960s. So we're working in terms of those protests. What if we too, in our capacity as academics and researchers and teachers and students, want to resist the continued imposition of a neoliberal political rationality, but have no wish to retain or restore the paternalistic class-bound model of the university that's associated with the writings of people like Matthew Arnold and F.R. Leavis and Cardinal Newman that you can see on the right there? Does taking part in that kind of struggle require that us too, like the protesters associated with the Free University and Occupy movements, does it require us too to have the courage to experiment with new economic, legal and political systems for the production and the organisation and the publication and sharing and dissemination of knowledge and ideas? Do we have to be open to radically transforming the material practices and social relations of our own labour? That's the kind of question that we're engaging with and asking. So one of the reasons we established the Centre for Disruptive Media here at Coventry was to address some of these questions. And disruption is a term that we adopted from business studies. Although actually it has its origins in the economic theory of Marx, according to which capitalist development occurs as a result of the creative destruction of the previous economic system. So that idea of creative destruction was subsequently adapted and popularised by the economist Joseph Schumpeter, which is why it's sometimes referred to as Schumpeter's Gale. Then it's been adapted again more recently by Clayton Christensen, who's a professor of business administration at Harvard Business School. And he adapted it in the guise of disruptive technology, which is a concept he uses to develop his theory of the innovator's dilemma. So, a disruptive technology for Christensen is one that facilitates the production of a new market for products and services and eventually succeeds in disrupting an already existing market. So, the example I've given you here is that by 2020, income generated from streaming films and TV programs using services such as Amazon and Netflix is predicted to surpass that generated from cinema tickets. But the example of this that's perhaps used most often is that of the mobile phone, which with their built-in cameras has disrupted both the compact analog and digital camera. And this has famously led Kodak, which at one time had 90% of film and 85% of camera sales in the US, and who actually invented the digital camera in 1975, Kodak filed for bankruptcy in 2012. So Christensen's argument is that organisations entering these markets early have strong first-mover advantages over later entrants. The problem is that as these new organisations succeed and grow larger, it becomes progressively difficult for them to enter into the even newer small markets that are destined in turn to become the large ones in future. which means that they themselves are likely to be disrupted eventually by other, fresher, upstart organisations. And this is because of what Christensen calls the innovator's dilemma, whereby for reasons of institutionalisation, companies find it very difficult to invest adequate resources in disruptive technologies, which are lower margin technologies that their customers don't want until their customers want them, and then it's too late. But it's not just technologies and markets that can be frequently disrupted by such innovations. With the UK experiencing a prolonged period of economic austerity, the government has long been emphasising the possibilities of private entrepreneurialism, particularly in the high-growth digital and financial services industries, championing the development of a tech city cluster around Silicon Roundabout in East London. However, actually, these tech companies, employ very few people in relation to the revenues they generate. So, for example, I've just come back from Norrköping in Sweden. And Norrköping used to be known as the Manchester of Sweden because of its textile industries. Now, they've all gone now, and the city's trying to reposition itself in terms of new technologies. The problem is, those old manufacturing industries employed hundreds of thousands of people, whereas even the largest tech companies employ only 20 to 30,000 at most. It's a situation that Richard Florida describes as the Great Reset. And when there's previously been a major reset, when the petrol engine replaced the horse, for example, the jobs lost was soon replaced by others created in the car factories of Ford and others. But it's hard to see what's going to be the equivalent of car factories for today. And the result is expected to be a cull of large numbers of middle-class jobs and incomes with very little to put in their place. According to the Bank of England, as many as 15 million British jobs might disappear from the twin forces of artificial intelligence and automation within a generation. From this perspective, a company such as Uber assumes the appearance of a dry run for autonomous vehicles in which humans stand in for the robots to come. Meanwhile, digital capitalism's constant surveillance and monitoring and behavioural control of individuals is a way of having workers become the robots that they're eventually going to be replaced by. So it's something of a halfway house between the so-called third industrial revolution of digitisation and the fourth industrial revolution, what's called Industry 4. That latter revolution is characterised by the technical integration of cyber-physical systems into production and logistics. It has Uber and Amazon and Facebook among its main pioneers. So why then, as media and cultural studies researchers, did we base our centre on a concept of disruption that we've taken from the field of business studies? Well, firstly, because it's impossible to escape business and the market entirely. And that's especially true for those of us who work in the university. And secondly, because doing so would not necessarily be desirable. As the philosopher Jacques Derrida contends, a distinction needs to be made between a certain commercialist determination of the market and a sense of the market as a public space, which is actually a condition of what's called democracy. So what we did is we used theorists such as Derrida and Foucault and others I'm going to mention to develop a critical approach to business and the market. And we did this not with a view to somehow leaving capitalism and the market behind and replacing them with something else, such as the commons or even communism. The problem with that kind of directly oppositional stance is that it risks the unwitting recreation of the very thing that you're trying to escape, only in a different guise. It's something we can kind of see a lot with platform cooperativism at the minute. So instead we adopted Derrida's procedure for reading the philosopher Hegel in his dialectic according to a non-oppositional difference. And so we follow the logic of business and the market through to the end without reserve, to the point of agreeing with it against itself. And this we're transforming it radically from within. Or if any Deleuzians out there, if you prefer that language, who develop intimate forms of critique. So critique, not so much as a negative refusal of the free market and its creative destruction, as an affirmative or inventive means of mutating it. So just to be clear, we're not interested in the process of disruption for the reasons that Clayton Christensen and Silicon Valley are interested in it, as a way of understanding innovation-driven economic growth to show how it's possible to succeed as a creative disruptor. That is a smaller company with fewer resources that's able to successfully challenge established incumbent businesses. It's not our intention to try and sustain and develop the current economic system by playing up the potential of disruptive technologies to generate innovations that are capable of facilitating the creation of a new market, while at the same time playing down the disruptive effects of these technologies. Rather than helping the free market to constantly renew itself by moving fast and breaking things, are interested in disrupting the disruptors, if you like, in disrupting those kind of free market economics by using such technologies to experiment with the invention of new economies and new economic models. And that's kind of why we used the term affirmative disruption, to kind of signal this difference. We use this concept in the sense in which Roberto Esposito writes of an affirmative biopolitics in relation to the work of Foucault. So here, an affirmative biopolitics is one that is not defined negatively with respect to the dispositives of modern power knowledge, but is rather situated along the line of tension that traverses and displaces them. So we're trying to disrupt, but in an affirmative, positive direction. So in the Centre for Disruptive Media, this has taken the form of, we're first studying, researching disruptive technologies, including those associated with mobile phones. And part of this involved a £1 million project that digitised British Telecom's archive. In the centre, we've also been experimenting with the development of use of disruptive media technologies ourselves, including open access and open data and open science and open education resources. So our JISC-funded Living Books About Life project, for example, created 21 free open access books in just 7 months. I'm going to come back to say more about that project in a moment. But importantly, the centre went beyond current definitions of disruptive technologies, and that it was interested not so much in helping to create new markets by doing things the market doesn't expect, but in disrupting and displacing the market itself by exploring new economic models and new economies, as I say. So we witnessed the development in our then media department of 4 open media classes, which were designed to make high quality teaching and learning resources freely available and accessible. These open media classes, supported by JISC as part of their Open Educational Resources programme, were created by staff, students and visiting contributors to the department. And by using apps that integrated tweets and photographs and podcasts, they enabled online participation and contribution from other HE institutions, professional practice networks and wider communities of media researchers, teachers and learners. And they did so synchronously with their face-to-face delivery at Coventry rather than post hoc or asynchronously as in the case of MIT's open courseware. So our experience is that the students at Coventry have benefited enormously from this kind of open manner of working. Not only have they been given feedback and commentary by scholars and practitioners from all over the world, the exposure of their work has led to opportunities for projects, professional placements, and opportunities at levels way beyond any that were previously available. So, for example, one second-year photography student was invited to apply for an internship with Annie Leibovitz in New York after her work was seen on the class site. And then the work of another, you can see here, was featured on the front page of the British Journal of Photography. However, it's not just students at Coventry who've benefited. These classes are open online to anyone, anywhere, for free, to participate in, to add to the discussion, even remix and mash up in real time or at their own convenience. This applies to the schedule, the lectures, the lesson contents, recommended reading, recorded talks and interviews with visiting speakers, as well as a number of practical how-to videos, all of which are available under a CC license. The use of blogs and Twitter and other social media means that participants, both the in-class accredited fee-paying students and those taking our open classes for free remotely, they can all interact and contribute through discussion, feedback and suggestions. So the big picture is what our lectures used to like, our lecture thesis looked like, which is a bit like this, and the one right at the bottom on the left there is what the same place looks like now, so it's kind of much more flat and horizontal. So for example, our photography and narrative and picture in the body, they're the two longest standing of these open classes, and they date back from January 2010. They enable teachers and researchers and students and practitioners from both inside and outside the university to collaboratively produce and curate and engage with a wide range of media and educational resources relating to photography. And after featuring in Wired magazine, where they were described as shaking up education, approximately 1,000 people signed up to take these open classes, with 20,000 people attending in August 2011 alone. So you can see that one of the main markets and businesses we're involved in disrupting with these kind of experiments with new economic models is our own, that of higher education. What we're interested in is the future of university teaching and learning and research and publication in the age of disruptive media technologies, such as those associated with open education. In particular, we want to ask, what is the university's social contract going to be in the 21st century? What's its legitimating idea? Charting the fate of the university in a world dominated by an economic logic of profit and loss in his 1996 book, The University in Ruins, Bill Reddings demonstrated how the liberal humanist notion of culture as the legitimating idea of the modern university has reached the end of its usefulness. It's been replaced by the concept of excellence, which is the single advantage of being meaningless, or to put it more precisely, non-referential. So this process of de-referentialisation means we can't return to what Reddings called the University of Culture, which was epitomised for him by the German model that Humboldt instituted at the University of Berlin. This university is ruined and has lost its historical reason for being. Any attempt to dwell in those ruins amounts to taking recourse to romantic nostalgia for Reddings. Meanwhile, much of the talk around the future of the university has been focused on ex-MOOCs that are largely designed either to replace traditional learning in the public university with a venture capital-backed business, or to provide a defensive response on the part of established institutions to such disruptive innovation, and maybe include something like future learning in that. But what if we are just as uncomfortable with the way the universities, in their drive to be ever more business-like, are today following closely the corporate model of excellence, efficiency and performativity, complete with the online distance learning and outsourcing, offshoring and global university systems that Andrew Ross describes in Nice Work and If You Can Get It, which is the book at the top right there. What, to echo Cardinal Newman's question from the 19th century, is our idea of the university? Or as Stefan Collini's 21st century version has it, down the bottom there, what are universities for? This question is an extremely important one for us. A lack of paid employment, combined with the associated falling value of labour, could quite conceivably lead to the breakdown of Western consumer society if there's no system of finance capable of continuing to extend credit or a universal basic income to sustain those large sectors of the population who would now be rendered surplus to requirements. In addition, higher minimum wages and taxes, including a tax on robots, which is something that Bill Gates has suggested, to cover for the lack of tax income from human workers and pay for things like universal basic income and the education and retraining of those who've been replaced by robots. They might also be needed to cover the costs of this transition to the post-work era and look after those who've been left behind. And as we've seen, it's a segment of the population that includes large numbers, not just of the working classes, but of the middle classes too. And this is one of the explanations given for the student protest I began with, and their demands for equal rights for other university workers, such as cleaners. Students are not just fighting for themselves and their own interests. They realise that far from university being a route to social mobility and financial security, many of today's undergraduates will have debts of £50,000 when they graduate, and they themselves are likely to become low-waged, precarious workers. So if we are going to find a way of responding to this great reset, perhaps as Brian Holmes has suggested, by placing more emphasis on cooperative processes, on the maintenance of community and ecology and the development of a philosophy of coexistence, rather than the kind of centralised monetary authority that Christine Lagarde and the IMF have in mind, then high quality university level education is clearly going to have an important role to play. The university is somewhere that can help actualise such alternative modes of being, both because, as Stefan O'Harney and Fred Moten emphasised in their book The Undercommons, the university is this incredible gathering of resources, and because, as we've seen, the university is one of the places where the imposition of this kind of free market globalisation and its emphasis on privatisation and deregulation and the interest of the market has still been struggled over. The university is also important because it's where the 24-hour hyper-competitive entrepreneurial subjectivity that's so characteristic of today's creative industries, where everyone lives and works like an artist, or at least wants to. The university is where it was first developed, before it was exported throughout society more widely. Hence, Facebook's HQ is known as a campus. So the university seems an appropriate place to experiment with developing different forms of subjectivity to that kind of neoliberal entrepreneur of the self. So our work, and we can see if Luke is in this photo somewhere, our work at Coventry has just had the aim of supporting high quality university education in the era of MOOCs and VLEs and flipped and blended learning, but also viewing the emergence of disruptive technologies creating an opportunity to rethink the university, fundamentally, yet also creatively and affirmatively, in order to produce a counter-model to both the public university of culture and the neoliberal university of excellence. And since it's one of the institutions which, as researchers, we're most closely tied, we focused as part of this on the scholarly publishing industry, together with the associated liberal humanist values and practices, based as they are on ideas of the individual proprietor author, originality, the codex print book, and the finished static object. And the idea has been to interrogate and transform what it means to create and publish and disseminate knowledge and research. After all, historically, the university has been the institutional expression of the medium of the book. Indeed, it's difficult to think of a major continental philosopher or critical theorist who does much more than write paper-centric books, book chapters and journal articles. What then will it mean for how we live, work and think as university teachers and researchers and students if writing, print on paper and the fixed and finished codex is no longer the natural and normative medium in which such activities are conducted, but is rather affirmatively disrupted by and absorbed into a variety of other, often hybrid, multimodal and mobile forms of communication. Network computers, databases, online archives, blogs, video sharing and other social networks. Okay, I can mention that, but it's kind of hard to get your head around a little bit at first, so I'm just going to provide some examples of what's possible from the research that we've been doing here at Coventry. So this is the first example. This is Living Books About Life, which is published by Open Humanities Press, and there's a series of open access books about life, life being understood both philosophically and biologically. They provide multiple points of translation and contestation between the humanities and the sciences. So the 25 books that make up the Living Books series have been created by a globally distributed network of writers and editors. These collaboratively produced books repackage existing open access science-related research content from repositories such as Archive, Public Library of Science and PubMed Central. And they do it by clustering it around selected topics to form a series of coherent single-themed volumes on air, bioethics, cosmetic surgery, extinction, symbiosis, as you can see here. The peer-reviewed open access research content of these books is then supplemented with additional material, extracts from books and pages and snippets, but also so as to make full use of the wiki platform which the project's hosted, images and infographics and podcasts and videos. In this way, the project tests some of the physical and conceptual limitations of the traditional codex book volume. A number of books in the series include whole books, for example. One editor even went so far as to produce 2 tables of contents. So a standard printable table and a second table in the form of an interactive map containing article summaries that was geolocated with surveillance cameras. These books are living in the sense not only are they open free for anyone anywhere to read, they're all also open on a read-write basis. Users are able to interact with the technology to help continually compose and add to and edit and translate, remix and reuse them. In this way, these living books can be produced in an open, collaborative, decentralised fashion, not just by their initial authors, but by a multiplicity of often anonymous collaborators distributed around the world. So what the project's doing is engaged in rethinking the book as a collaborative processual endeavour. As long as they have access to the internet, anyone can get involved in creating books for the series or in adapting existing books for use in teaching and learning. In this way, producing an alternative open educational resource where the content and form of the book can be negotiated and updated and altered by learners themselves. It's kind of been, the concept's been borrowed from a few different projects now, which is that one from Punctum Books there, right at the bottom. So what you can see is it's important for us to disarticulate and transform the power and authority of the book, but not just that of the book. It's also important to affirmatively disrupt the power, the appeal of all those common sense ideas we inherited with the book, such as fixity, that a book is finished once it's printed, the finished and finishable object, even the individual liberal human subject. So changing those kind of liberal practices of the traditional academic researchers is not just about who we publish with. Open Humanities Press say rather than Verso. It's about transforming ourselves and our subjectivities, who we are, by developing different, non-liberal, non-humanist ways of doing things. This means we have to go even further than Eileen Joy of Punctum Books when she writes about the importance of avoiding this fate of self-absorbed radicals who think being political means publishing leftist diatribes with the intellectual property thugs at Verso Books. We need to engage critically and creatively with the very concept of the liberal humanist subject that underpins our way of being and doing as researchers, together with those ideas that have been inherited with it, and that we've been talking about. The name proprietorial author, as I say, the book, originality, authority, copyright, along with their accompanying practices of reading, writing, interpretation and critique. We need to do this by actually performing these concepts and values differently in the ways in which we live and act and work in the world. To just provide some more examples, as a follow-up to Living Books, we developed an interactive photographic encyclopedia for Europeana Space called Photomediations, an open book. And the idea of Photomediations was to redesign a coffee table book as an online experience, one that explores the dynamic relationship between photography and other areas of the arts and humanities. It too uses open digital content drawn from various online repositories and tagged with CC BY and other open licenses, and includes well over 200 images. So the book's 4 main chapters on light, movement, hybridity and networks are then followed by 3 open chapters made up of a social space, an online exhibition and an open reader that was again available to be populated with content by users. Meanwhile, Adnan Hadzi and course collectively produced After Video is doing something similar in the form of digital video produced as a physical object, namely an assembly on-demand video book stored on a Raspberry Pi computer and packaged in a VHS case. Like photomediations, the project's exploring the process of moving from a grammatological era of communicating by writing to a post-literary era of communicating more by flows of media that produce things like images, and what this means for us in academia and our publishing practices. However, rather than the still or photographic images as in photomediations, it's the production of moving images that's focused on here in order to rethink the book and theory after video. So I'm not going to detail them all, but some of our other projects concentrate on affirmatively disrupting our practice of individualistic named authorship, property rights and copyright, as well as academic social networks such as Academia EDU, the museum, the archive and the university. The important thing about these projects is that they're performative, in the sense they're not concerned with just representing the world, but also with interacting with it in order to make things happen. This, taken together, constitute a plurality of forms of political intervention that are responding to specific issues across a number of different sites. Not only the university, but the worlds of education, art, activism, business, politics, technology and the media. Their shared aim is to disarticulate the existing playing field and its manufactured common sense, the common sense, we all know what a book is, and foster instead a variety of antagonistic spaces for the invention of radically different systems for the creation and the publication and communication and ownership of knowledge and research from those that are currently dominant. This is why a range of different projects are needed, because that kind of counter-hegemonic struggle is a process involving a multiplicity of ruptures, as Chantal Mouffe puts it. So, for example, my current work in progress is provisionally titled Data Communism versus Uber Capitalism. And it's designed not merely to offer a critique of the for-profit sharing and gig economy business of digital capitalism, it's also intended to form part of a performative media project that's concerned with interacting with the world in order to invent a different, more caring future for the sharing and gig economies, for our towns and cities, but also post-industrial, post-capitalist society. I couldn't get A and B for Coventry, but this is Hackney, and yeah, there's a lot, but Hackney is kind of hipster central, so there probably would be. So the aim of this project is to make a counter-hegemonic intervention by re-articulating the situation in a new configuration, so affirmatively disrupting digital capitalism, so that it might begin to replace Airbnb and Uber and Deliveroo and so on with a kind of consortium of counter-information and data platforms. Among other things, data communism asks, how can we as researchers and students work collaboratively, devise our own information and data commons as a way of creating an actual effective point of potentiality and transformation with a view to countering digital capitalism and its for-profit sharing and gig economies? Have we got about 5 minutes, you think?
Just about.
Just about, okay. So I'm just wondering whether to do the new... Should I do the new research centre? When's this video going to go out? As long as it's after tomorrow, it'll be all right. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly do the new research centre. I'm a bit nervous about this. So this is our new research centre. It's going to be launched shortly as a way of disrupting our current Centre for Disruptive Media. And this is a new research centre we're going to call the Post Office. And the idea comes from very much from Michel Foucault's 1980 Mask Philosopher interview with Le Monde, in which he insisted on remaining anonymous, as the Post Office is going to engage with and create not so much mass media as masked media. And the first mask is that of the name itself, the Post Office. As we know, social media and social networks are contributing to a process of kind of neoliberal academic subjectivation in which we all supposed to act as highly visible entrepreneurs of ourselves and our work through the adoption of self-presentation techniques originating in the culture of Silicon Valley. So we're supposed to act on Twitter like we're micro-celebrities and everyone's interested in what we have for breakfast. Self-quantification, that we're wondering about our counts and our hits. and self-promotion, endlessly going on about ourselves. So this kind of process of self-forming that can be linked to what Roger Burris calls the metricization of the academy. The immediate temptation is to react to this situation by staying offline and not using the likes of Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn at all. However, it's not clear really to what extent privacy from these networks is still possible in the post-Snowden era. We're all kind of on Facebook and Twitter, whether we're signed up to it or not. I mean, I am. I'm not on any of that. I'm not signed up to them, but you probably put me on there, you're tagging me, you're doing whatever you're doing. I'd like to think you weren't, but I've got to accept it. So, with the post office, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be hiding in plain sight. Not by putting something over our faces, like here, but I'm really tempted for that for the website. But by choosing a name that does a similar job as the Guy Fawkes masks do for the likes of Anonymous. After all, you've got to think about where you're going to hide a leaf. The best place to hide a leaf is in a forest. So we've deliberately chosen a name that's the antithesis of individualistic micro-celebrity, in that it represents a public institution rather than a privatised utility. The post office is a form of communication that brings people together and helps form a communication. It's also a name that's distinctly unglamorous. But most importantly, the post office can't be easily found online, and this used in that kind of self-quantification, self-promotion or in branding, since the post office is already a brand. If you're going to look for us in Coventry Post Office, it'll take a little bit of finding. That's our idea. Okay, I'm going to end. I'm going to end by leaving you with some questions, and it's here that the reasons for beginning with the protest of 2010 should become really clear. As we can see, a number of critics have pointed out that cultural forms such as music and literature and cinema have not caught up with the change in public mood post-2010. Instead, they're still dominated, as Rian Jones says in this book, and she's talking about the music industry, they're still dominated by careerist and commercial imperatives, hostility towards the new, the untried and the perhaps unprofitable, and the reliance on resuscitating previous forms at the expense of innovation, and the social stratification of access. So the questions I want to leave you with are these. To what extent can the same be said of the majority of university teaching, learning and research, and the forms they currently take? Have they too yet to catch up with the change in political mood post-2010? To put it another way, if the university is being disrupted by Ball and Mal and MOOCs, is it being disrupted enough? Thanks very much for listening and pay attention. Appreciate it.